So first, let me begin by thanking NITD. I know this is my third time presenting here. The first time I came, it was pretty small, a lot of educators in the building, and the second time I came, I saw a lot of growth. And this third time I'm coming now is beautiful. So thank you for being here. I want to thank my research partner, Betsy Wilson. We researched together, and that's why we are here now. I want to thank all the interpreters for everything you do every day. I know it's easy just to participate, and I wanted to thank all the interpreters here. This shows your hard work, and I am happy that you're here to learn and have a big heart and are open to learning new things. I thank you for the interpreters here on stage for me, because as I talk about my research, I want to make sure that I am clear, so I did include a PowerPoint presentation. Why am I interested in deaf education and interpreting? I've been interpreting for a very long time. 34 years. It really feels like 34 minutes. Every day is something new, is a challenge. I'm still learning as a practitioner. And when you're teaching in that direct educated classroom, I changed my focus and started working with deaf adults. But my point is, the experience has taught me a lot about deaf children, deaf blind, meaning I have direct experience with both populations and many more. I want to start teaching interpreters before they graduate and go out into the field, because there's many uncertainties for interpreting schools. I want them to be successful. More and more deaf and hard of hearing schools are being shut down, and mainstream schools are where many deaf students are attending today. And I'm really just puzzled by it. We need to show success in mainstream schools, since that is popular today. I applied for a grant for this study, and I wanted to give you a background about my studies. And that's what I'm going to do this afternoon in this PowerPoint. Many of you are young, old, new interpreters, very experienced interpreters. But we all know that educational settings are still a challenge. It really depends on the situation, and it's hard to pinpoint every situation. You're always required to be learning new things. It's our responsibility to make sure deaf students are successful through their school's experience and later in life. I'm going to ask the interpreters here what they saw and what they had a challenge with in my study. This is the interpreters I asked in my study what they found challenging. They were explaining that many students didn't acquire language before entering the field or entering a school setting, or their sign language was very weak and it was becoming their second language when it should be their first. Some schools do hire certified interpreters, but just because they're certified, does that mean they're skilled? Anybody, my brother can sign, anyone can sign, and they're hiring A lot of times they're just hiring if anyone can sign, not even certified. Also, interpreters have a duty to be up for the challenge and make sure they follow through with being skilled and certified. A lot of times, interpreting programs do not teach how to work with children. This is vital that the early acquisition of language is successful for deaf children. Many interpreters have various skills, but sometimes this is not enough. This is a quote that I like to say, the myth of inclusion. A lot of times in the classroom, they see an interpreter and the teacher just assumes that they're part of that class, and it's really a challenge for interpreters to stick to their role when it looks like they have equal responsibilities in the classroom. Interpreters also mention different boundaries and certifications that they need. And for the past 6 or 7 years, we've used the concept of mediated interpretation. In my research, we talk about educational interpreters and how they can be successful. But people need to read our research to understand what is the work that we do. And that's through mediated interpretations 100% of the time. And the third is that everyone's making their individual decisions. The principal may tell the parents or tell the interpreter that the interpreter is doing a very good job. But the principal may not know what a skilled interpreter will look like. Interpreters who were questioned during my study were talking about the success and how to get to that success and where the content was and who we were interpreting for who. When we looked at this research, we were looking for skilled interpreters. Because if you hire a qualified interpreter, that doesn't mean that everyone is the same. That's a problem if everyone's treated the same as far as their skills. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Interpreters in schools are needing to decide who and what and when they are interpreting. I started with 23 deaf students. Maybe you're thinking, oh, this is a grant to study K-12 schooling. But they were deaf children in the mainstream setting. But I think this can apply to future work as well. 2 students from 2nd grade to 12th grade. 42 students from those grades, ages 8 through 18. There was 22 interpreters. And again, we were all Canadian. All the interpreters were English-based interpreters. So when you look at interpreting, what makes it look like it's quality interpreting? What's the impact that they have on the social experience? What's the impact on their schooling experience, academic experience? There needs to be more research through the concept of bystander. in the classroom and many other places. And sometimes they're in mainstream environment and they start separating themselves with what's going on in the actual classroom. When we analyze interpreting, it's not the same as back in the day. You don't just check off the boxes and see if they are fulfilling the responsibilities. It's a lot more than just interpreting. It's how they're engaging with the classroom teacher, how they are engaging with the student. They really have to figure out the structure of that classroom. And I have 6 common discourse questions. Metacognitive, they're questions that the teacher wants to find out information and why and how something occurs and allow the students to connect what they know to what they don't know and what they're curious about. Excuse me. Metacognitive cognitive questions. So it's good to use those questions. I pick one way to analyze interpreting that way. Second is scaffolding. It's another technique that instructors will use. They're stacking information upon each other, upon that foundation. And that's called scaffolding. Many teachers are using these techniques and platforms. And this is how language functions. Reconceptualizing means that the teacher will explain the concept, and the teacher is aware that the student may not know and she may have to expand and describe and explain. But it's important for the students to see and hear the first time and then understand the meaning after. And they repeat this. The teacher repeats this. And this is a strategy for interpreters to manage their process and understand those different teaching discourse. Reciprocal teaching often happens from peer to peer. That they are equal in discussing. And it's important to teach it that way because students need to learn from other students and discuss how and watch other students and how they find out solutions. In the study that we're framing, we did have feedback. Feedback is something that we need to focus on. And that's how we learn and read those positive comments and constructive feedback as well. It's important that they have negative and positive feedback so we can grow. Teachers again have reasons for why the student, that deaf student's in the classroom with the interpreter. And in order to understand the results, sequencing is another discourse technique. And it's breaking down each section into smaller parts. And then they learn from that. Again, when we watched the video clips, we saw that the interpreters often didn't use the correct sequence. And the deaf student followed that and made a mistake because the interpreter had misaligned with the classroom teacher. So these were the 6 discourse frames. And here's a slide that will show that. Of the 33 students, many of the interpreters were certified or had many years of experience. They were very qualified and experienced interpreters, and they wanted to see what happens in the classroom. Even the best interpreter in the classroom had challenges. If you look at the column that says accurate and effective, you see the question, what? 80% aren't successful? Interpreters, what do the interpreters do? And what do they need to replace for this to become successful? If the student answers incorrectly, they may have lost confidence. And we really need to think about each deaf student individually because everybody is different. And it really impacts the child's education. If you could provide an answer, the professor might ask why. Why is that your answer? How did you come up with that? And it's really important that the interpreter knows the content. Maybe they're not familiar with political terms or the political process. And say you're in science class, you're not sure how that chemical reaction is occurring. It's extremely important that interpreter understands these processes. You can see that 86% was not interpreter accuracy. So again, the teacher has the intent to know, and maybe the teacher's pace was faster, so the interpreter had to use scaffolding methods and decided to condense the information. And that's a way for the students to participate in partners or learn from each other. The students are bystanders and often don't know what to do. And if the teacher didn't call on them and things aren't going well in the groups, the deaf student may feel left out and may not getting access to communication. Reconceptualizing means that 75% was inaccurate. And often the pace of the classroom and the pace of the instruction was too fast. So the interpreters were thinking about, how can I reconceptualize the meaning instead of thinking about how they can show meaning and build that into their interpretation. And they're giving up information, they're omitting it, and that's not the function of this. The interpreter may say first, this is a chemistry lab. And the instructor gave steps 1 through 5. And they evaluate that information and they say, come on, don't you know the steps 1 through 5? And the interpreter is processing and then misses the second step, misses the third step, and then did hear the fourth step, but they're missing 2 steps in between, and it caused a lot of confusion. And what could happen, there could be an explosion in the class because they did not have all 4 steps with that chemical process. The interpreter needs to take the time to explain each process in the educational classroom setting. Interpreters need to know how to structure information. If the student doesn't have engagement in the classroom, they will not have equal access to the content. If you're curious more about the general study, you can see that the background presentation, there's a website that you can access. So again, the results are surprising, right? And it could be very disturbing. You can see a lot of successful work of interpreters and you can hire them. Skilled interpreters, but we need to analyze from the education perspective. The language is different. And compared to interviewing people, they really didn't understand the process. And when we think about how language matches the structure in the classroom. Teachers need to know how to integrate the deaf student so they feel equal and successful. For me, the inclusion means three things: emotional, so they feel part of the classroom and they can pass their courses. And third is intellectual engagement and how they learn. If you check off these three, maybe a possibility that you can call the situation inclusion. But if you don't have one of these, you cannot call it this. The results are very disheartening. Betsy and I, when I shared the results, Betsy said, you know what, let's establish another research study on how to fix these issues. You know, we need to look at this in more detail and go back and use that tap there. When Betsy suggested that we do this again, that we take up and think about the processes. Because there's evidence to show interpreters missing content and losing that language, those functions aren't there. It's interesting to see their processing and analyzing what is it that is going through their mind and what's blocking them to be successful in functioning education classroom. So we had 2 research questions to get us started. Again, compared to research, my research study emphasized that their thought process and processing is different. What's going on in their mind while they're interpreting? And how do we analyze that? We could use the Think Out Loud protocol and the simulated recall to help us understand what's going on. So that is a question. I know it's kind of hard to read the graph, but we had 12 participants, and they are great interpreters. 2 interpreters had ASL as their first language because they were ACODAs. And 2 members had the certification. And I don't know if you're familiar with, oh, holy God, it's a very hard test. It's very difficult. Not many people pass this. But we had 2 who were CODAs, certified interpreters. 3, excuse me. 3 had RID certifications. And at that time, they introduced me to CEC. When I was 5, just to be clear, I got my S or CSE. But yeah, that's an old certification. So these 2 interpreters had CICTRID certification. It doesn't vary with new interpreters. They had at least have 4 years to 33 years. One person has 6 to 10 years of experience.
8 of our interpreters were 11 to 17 years of experience interpreting. So they were well versed in their field. 30 years had more than 30 years experience. It's pretty amazing. The participants in this program were not using new interpretations. We're looking at student performance experiences. Have you all had experience with TAP? Anyone? The Think Out Loud protocol, you've heard of it? Okay. Rico's familiar with TAP, and it helps us to know what's happening in somebody's mind while they're working. Often they use different languages for interpreting practices. It's used for other fields as well. It helps us to understand what we can't see visually, the processing in our mind. We may ask a person to speak during our work to show what's happening in their mind. Using TAP process, interpreters can watch a video of the classroom and use that to work on and practice. And then we had real life students that were given the student profile to match that videotape. We used 3 different classrooms, groups. It ranged from elementary to middle school to high school, and they used the TAP process while they watched the segment and had to think how they would do this, what strategies. We videotaped that Think Out Loud protocol for 20 minutes. And when we finished, we saw the processing and then the interpreting. When we were finished with that, looking back, we looked at the work to see that that part was not so well, and that was more comfortable for me, and just going through the work and talking out loud. TAP means that you don't have to give a ton of information. You allow yourself to express what you're thinking about, so you can try to answer the questions that helps you understand things more critically. Those 3 things, TAP, stimulated videos, and it was analyzed several times. Betsy and I analyzed it, and we found that the teacher and certified interpreter analyzed it as well, 5 times each. And then we took it together and see what we could do to watch it again and code those common things. We came up with 4 different categories. TAP, then we came up with plenty of data as well. It was a challenge for us, but it means plenty. We had a plethora of data, if you will. We looked at each of the coded, and we found that coding labels, we found coding labels that emerged in the work. What people say in their sentences when they think out loud match the process in the 4 categories that we created. The blue here on the top were comments related to meaning and the teacher intent of the message in the lesson. And it showed that the interpreter was using how the teacher was teaching and used those strategies.
This is an example of higher level order thinking. And think about the student's specific needs. You can stand, you can sit, compared to, should I stand? Let me show you how the thinking process works for an interpreter. These are questions that interpreters think while interpreting. Focusing on linguistics means the interpreters were taking and thinking about the words only. After the groups, the 4 categories, we analyzed each one, and the interpreter saw success, or the work was ineffective or effective. Those 12 interpreters found that their interpreting was effective. There's no question. Using TAP for most of the comments, you'll see which categories, and 48% of their comments had to do with language and what the teacher was doing and trying to accomplish. What is the turn taking, and what was their goal of all that work? About 40% of the interpreters decided that the interpreting decisions, and 90% focused on student needs, and 3% focused on language words usage. And finally, they emphasized the processing, interpreter processing. This is another example. That interpreter clearly is focused on the processing about the teacher's goal and why they're using that language and what to do to relate to that student need. When we think about the sign for this drug, we make comments, and 46 comments total were from this in the interpreter and social studies. And a good number of teachers use that language as well. It's pretty good. Next. You see the different breakdowns in numbers and how the numbers relate to interpreter and the meaning, and interpreters for the student, and the interpreter processing and language. For me, I can look over that and see that interpreter has 0 relations to language with the teacher, and they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about those 3 processes. One comment during the health class, the question was, RF was our acronym for the red flags. So you see 1 or 2 comments like that, and they are both opposite. An interpreter needs to think of how to match what they are doing compared to, I'll show you another example later. But anyway, I didn't want to jump ahead. So the mostly effective interpreters, 2 out of 12. As you can see that their similar habit or pattern of work. 34% of the interpreters were working with teachers' intent and meaning of the topic, and 90% were focused on changing to match the student, and 15% focused on language. But it's open to see that your effective work can be mostly effective There was 5 out of 12 interpreters that commented. 27 comments for the health and social studies. The other interpreters had over 45 comments for social studies and 31. And you can see that number and qualified are correlated. Most of the time, you could have successful interpreting means what the teacher is doing and what language is being used. You can see the numbers on the slide. That language 0 or 13% focused on the student, and 40 or 53% focused on interpreting themselves and the interpreter, and 34% focused on the language and the linguistic forms. It was a heavy focus for me on the self and the lack of focus on the teachers and their intent. 0% commented on the student. If you're throwing things out there and we have no concept of where we need to meet the individual, what do we do then? It means that we are supposed to continue throwing that information where interpreters are just producing information that's coming from nowhere. But it's funny when we take a course and we really focus on the goal of the interpretation and match and relate it to teacher intent. And here the study shows this. Again, that example said that 24, the comments were 24, but it didn't talk about how many. This example is when the interpreters focus on finger spelling when they're not using signs or meaning. The teacher may be walking back and forth and the interpreter is not sure what to do. Instead of thinking about the interpreting or the teacher intent, they're more focused on the English word and finger spelling them. 4 out of the 12 interpreters in the study were ineffective. When the principal asked that school, said, "Oh, the interpreter's doing great," but he or she doesn't know how to analyze themselves to know what the signs mean and how they are ineffective. They may not be engaging the student academically or intellectually engagement as well. You can see the numbers on the slide. 40% commented that they focus on language and 40% focused on themselves and their thinking of the interpreting process. You all might be sitting in there and not feeling too good, right? So what is going on with the data and those of you in the preparation process in the career of interpreting? For example, Those 4 groups is what you can apply in this for future references. Again, interpreting examples from their work and comments about their work are the same idea. When they're asking what they were doing, if they were had effective interpreting, they were thinking and recalling about that and focusing more on the comments, and the people who were effective, they really looked at preparation and say, I look pretty good. And they would watch the videotape and say, yeah, my finger spelling is clear. But you say, well, finger spelling is not the issue here. That interpreter said that during their class, they were trying to figure out the teacher intent and how to apply that language to the interpretation. We noticed that it is a challenge for interpreters to have success in that area, but they are thinking instead of just signing without thoughts. It's a very higher order of thinking. The interpreter did have effective work because she was thinking about her processing. And we noticed that herself in the interpreting wasn't just about finger spelling. That's what the student was actually thinking about, how she can relate this to the knowledge she already has, and notice that that experience and that background knowledge can help her and support her interpretations. If you look at the DM's comments, it shows that there's no responsibility for her work, her or his work. It was a map that was very noisy and they couldn't see the students, so she had many excuses. They used very assertive language, saying that it wasn't their fault, that there's other things going on that they couldn't interpret successfully. And then if you look at CM's comment, she just said, I'm lost. I can't focus. My mind is somewhere else. I can't interpret effectively. She was able to analyze her work and understand what was going on and was able to admit that honestly. But she did just say she gave up. The 3 red flags that the comments were flagged, one comment says that it was derogatory about this teacher. And I know we're all human, but whereas interpreters don't like us, and we talk about derogatory about the teacher, we needed to keep in mind that when we're interpreting, we can't just start being distracted and being judgmental of the teacher. What does this show? That the experienced interpreter, their thought process and processing time was more in depth and more processing and analyzing what was going on in their mind. They saw that the TAP method worked really well, and they were able to use more complex understanding by teaming. And the group that was successful meant that the interpreter had very complex thinking in which they were working. and compared to more focused driven interpreters that have no idea what's going on and that are primarily looking at these complex criteria in which the classroom has. Interpreters that are accessible also have experience. When we're interpreters, we can't become distracted, so that will impact the interpretation. So let me talk about the results. When a very experienced interpreter is thinking and using processing in more depth processing and analyzing that as well, co-construct meaning to understand the children and be able to support the child, the student, to socialize and understand the content. The teacher and the interpreter must agree on the same thing and be able to work successfully together. But if you're just looking at that individual alone, you're not going to be effective. The group that is successful, looking back, said, oh, I've been much more successful in this process if there were lots of times where they could prep more efficiently compared to just using their knowledge and experiences. It will help them analyze the situation and be able to connect to the teacher's content in course. Betsy Watson and I talked about language interpreting publications and used TAPS, and there was one Swedish researcher that said, I'm not going to say his name right, it's JAAS something something, found similar results with translators. The experience translating has a different perspective and is much bigger and didn't focus on the words as much, and it became successful. And the more understanding meaning helped the audience understand as well. every study is going to have strengths and weaknesses. When I show the pool of 12 interpreters, but again, we have a myriad of data. And when written, we have written these results, but it may have been more effective if we would have had a video to be able to provide more evidence. And another weakness might be what do interpreters and students of interpreters need to know? We all have things to learn about the interpreting process. And we need to show how we can focus on that thinking in more depth and to have a higher level order of thinking as well. And that will ultimately result in more effective interpreting. That interactive process back and forth, that dialogue in the classroom must be used for success. And we were so obsessed over the English words, and we need to focus more on visual and conceptual signing to work for meaning. If a deaf child is completely inaccessible, the content will go right over their head, and the goal of the teacher in the lesson is not achieved. We need to think about what it means to interpret. It's important to think about that and understand how to discuss and dialogue about that and be able to ask questions and talk about the work. And this will influence the product and results of your work as well. If it's just transcoding and translating, that's a different interpreting product. For a child or adult, the results are very different. When you think again about the interpreter mentoring program and having interpreters use the TAP process for preparations, it will help new interpreters be able to think more in depth. And think about the mentoring and how they can discuss their work and focus more on the thinking rather than the words. Recently, in other research that I had not assessed, where two interpreters were taking notes on the words, and they said, I think that's a sign for that, I think that's a sign for that, and they were given that feedback, and they were just looking at the lexical level of the actual word, and we're not talking about general, we're talking about complex thinking. If we use feedback, we will become more successful interpreters. We need to change our thinking and analyze our thinking and interpreting process. That's just information that I'm giving you about the 4 categories that hopefully can help teachers that teach interpreters. They need to ask the interpreter during the planning process in their school, interpreting school, and maybe they will see those 4 labels may be helpful for them. The interpreters may be able to assess themselves more in depth. My last question to you is, are we using the TAPs to help prepare for interpreting? and how we teach our interpreters. Thank you so much for your attention and for not falling asleep today. And if you have any questions or comments, please email me. Thank you so much.